we're going to jump in and just have a little introduction in terms of who's here on the panel, and then we'll start this conversation. I think a lot of what we've heard over the course of the day so far has been about, I think, as creatives, how many hats we have to wear in quick succession, often. And so this, I think, is going to be a bit of a conversation as to how do we do that? How do we kind of change lanes? Or do we need to change lanes? And how is it done as well? I'm going to throw it over to our panel just to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves and a little bit about their work as well. So, Sarah, we might start with you.
Okay, hello. My name is Sarah Hone. I am the Associate Artistic Director of Bow Street Academy, the National Screen Acting School. I'm also a casting director and a psychotherapist, and I'm a mentor with Minding Creative Minds recently enough. I started off as an actor and I worked in production. Started casting on the Mad Max film many years ago in Sydney, and then moved to Japan, worked for Disney as a dancer for many years, and then came back here, started teaching, producing, directing, and now I'm in my current roles.
Wow. Try fitting that into a sentence. Thank you. And welcome.
Thank you.
Let's, please. Brian.
Hi, my name is Brian O'Regan. My background is more in classical music. So I worked as a classical musician for a number of years before studying arts and festival management in Edinburgh. Worked with a lot of different organisations, both internally and externally. Moved back to Ireland just at the peak of COVID, just before it all kind of crashed in 2020. So I currently run a venue down in County Wicklow, and I started my own consulting company in 2020 as well, doing research and consultancy projects. And I'm also a mentor with Minding Creative Minds.
Talking about the multiverse a little earlier, just hearing just the multi-nature of your own career as well. And Pamela, welcome.
Hi, thanks. My name is Pamela McQueen, and I'm a dramaturg in theatre, which is a strange German word, which means script development, really, for new plays in theatre. And my career has been enmeshed in theatre, really, all the way through since my college days. I spent about 10 years being a backstage person, a stage and production manager, and a production manager of festivals. And then my changing lanes was becoming a dramaturg, which tied in a little bit to having a degree in English and bringing that back into my career about 10 years later. When I went over to the UK, did a master's, became associate dramaturg at the Tron Theatre and worked there for 5 years, and then came back to Ireland.
Again, a lot of international travel. I think it's a bit of a theme so far over the day as well. Just the fact that we all move around so much and have to do so much. For me, just hearing everyone talk so far over the course of the day, I find it really fascinating to hear where people have kind of come from in their careers and the amount of change they're going. A part of my mind is always on the idea of what's the next 10 years of change going to be like for people as well. This discussion is a little bit around that idea of the fact that we do all have to change lanes, sometimes out of pure love for it, but sometimes out of a kind of a necessity as well. And I think there is something sticky about being a professional creative. I'm glad you've introduced yourselves, because I think just responding to the kind of question, and what do you do, is a challenge enough for me as a creative. So what are some of the things that make being a professional creative sticky? We know it's complicated. We know even introducing ourselves can be a challenge. But I know you all work with a lot of different creatives as well. You're all on the mentoring scheme as well. So you have one-to-one conversations with a lot of people as well. What do you find sticky in terms of being a creative professional? Pamela, we might start with you.
What a broad question. I suppose I do work with a couple of resources for playwright development. I run the Mavens programme at the Mill Theatre, the Baptiste programme at Smock Alley, and then a new thing with Irish Theatre Institute and the Society of Performance Designers, which is all for playwrights doing continuing professional development. And maybe that's a kind of a sticky thing about at what point do you start looking to your own craft and practice about upskilling? And upskilling is kind of a continual thing, I think, for artists, as opposed to a once-off. I used a period of upskilling to do a clean and dramatic shift, because I left one part of the industry to go do a master's to go into dramaturgical development. But actually, I think it's more useful, from my perspective now, that upskilling is a continuing thing throughout your career, you know? And of course, Minding Creative Minds is very helpful with that. So a lot of mentorship that I work on is people at a particular point looking to move practice in shifting sideways, or actually moving into a different area within their practice. Is that helpful?
It is very helpful. In terms of working with people who are considering making a bit of a shift, kind of side of lane, and you were talking about kind of continual professional development, how would you suggest people keep that in mind or think about it? I mean, one way is, like, should we be open towards the idea of lots of options, or is there something about being more strategic to it? What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of strategic, I think, is really useful in terms of building a broader base for your career, because I think everyone's talked about this today, about the different hats that you're wearing. And I think for me and people I talk to, it's that those hats are supporting each other, that it's different sort of strings to your bow, but the bow is one complete object, to use a metaphor badly. So yeah, your sidebar thing should feed into your main practice, is the feedback that I get a lot of the time when I'm working for people. So that, like, if you have the office job, the classic sort of take the office job for money, it's actually kind of a blockage to your creative practice. But maybe if you teach something that you are practicing, it's actually a feedback loop and it helps you with your own practice.
Interesting. So actually, we've already spoken a little bit, I think, on one of the panels, the idea of teaching, especially in felting, which has opened my eyes to both felting and the idea of teaching what you do. So actually, there's something about the practices or hats you're wearing, how can they harmonize? That's kind of what I'm hearing. Sarah, your career has sort of slingshotted internationally. You've been working in Japan, Australia, back to Ireland as well. I mean, I imagine that involves sort of starting fresh in each. Yeah, okay. Could you speak a little bit more to that? What is it like, and what are the kind of skills or ways of thinking that might be useful? Because I think we're all kind of starting off again and again often, or there's lots of cycles to our work. So yeah, what kind of comes to mind for you around how have you managed that?
I actually think that having to start from the beginning in multiple different countries has made me hungrier to succeed, and it's made me braver, because I think I've got nothing to lose. I'm starting from the beginning. Yes, I have this experience, but it's in another country, and people kind of, they take that on board, but it's like, oh, but what do you know here? Who do you know here? So it's made me kind of hungrier to go, I'm just going to contact the best place that I can, and if they say no, they say no. So I think adaptivity is a very good skill to learn, and I think being thrown into the deep end and starting off in different continents and stuff, especially in Japan, where I didn't speak Japanese when I first moved over, that made me just go, feck it. I'm just going to contact the people that I want to work for, and the worst they can say is no.
I love the philosophy of feck it.
Yeah.
In terms of, look, just should be a T-shirt in that, I think. In terms of, I think there is, and it's already mentioned a little bit, the idea of having a broader horizon in terms of looking beyond Ireland, but also looking within it as well. If there were people who were curious, maybe, because to make those jumps, to go to Australia, go to Japan, to kind of leave the country is not a small act. For people who are maybe curious about exploring what work might look like for them beyond these shores, but, from the safety of their own home, what would you advise, or is there any thoughts you have around how can people begin to explore that? Is it a question of being online, looking around, or, what would you suggest helped you initially looking beyond first?
I suppose I always knew that I wanted to either tell stories or help other people tell stories, and also do that in a kind of therapeutic way. How we, and I think, it's such an Instagram tagline, but like living authentically. I hate, living authentically, if you know what you want. And I suppose I was fortunate that I knew I always wanted to work in this field, and I think I was open-minded to working in different elements. And I think sometimes we can go, oh, but this is what I am now. I don't want to move into something else. Nothing is permanent. We can move into this for this chapter and then move into something else and then move back to this. I think the thought that we have to define ourselves to people to fit into what other people think is like a proper job, I think that can be dangerous. I don't want to be defined by people. I don't need to fit into what they think is definable. People say, what are you? And I say, well, I'm this and this and this and this. And I realize that most people kind of, especially like my parents' generation, they don't really get that in a way, but what's your real job, But I don't need to be defined by people, and I think if we're open-minded and know that it's just different chapters and nothing is permanent and something can be, and I think that all these different hats inform the other, I know my work as a psychotherapist, even if I'm not practicing as that for, a year or something, that training informs how I work with people every day. It informs how I teach character. It informs how I run a casting session. And I think just having an open mind and going, this is a chapter, but this chapter will inform this chapter, and then I might go back to chapter 2 and then go back to chapter 5. And I think if you know that you want to be involved in whatever artistic industry you're involved in, just be open to kind of looking at different sides and knowing that just because you sidestep into something else, it doesn't mean that you can't step back into that one,
So it all stays, despite the chapters, stays within the kind of same narrative. And I know, Brian, I know Pamela as well, have all done a multitude of different things. In terms of, Sarah, in terms of identifying those other things that you could do, there's definitely there could be a strategic element to the idea of going, I'm good at this thing, I might also be good at that, and they might also pay me for teaching felting, which I'm still interested in moving into. But for you, it sounds like there's been a real kind of natural kind of progression to those, from casting into, drama therapy. For some people who that would seem like quite distant shifts. How have you kind of gone about exploring that? Have they been very natural, or has it been actually more conscious?
A little bit of both. I think I'm a naturally curious person, so and I'm very open-minded. So I've just been, if I'm in a different country, I'll go, what opportunities might there be here? And sometimes you dip your toe in and it doesn't suit, and sometimes it really does. So I think just being open and not feeling like, that you have to define yourself as one thing, I think that's dangerous, because I think then we can just go into something because it's safe or because other people, it's more understandable for other people. But we all have to pay our bills, obviously, as well, and that has to come into. But at one stage I was working freelance, I was working for 12 different, companies, and that was such a learning curve for me, And I think to get out of the idea that if you do something, it has to be what you do forever. It doesn't. It's just different chapters of your life and different parts of you, And I think if you're kind of feeding all those different parts of the creative and the kind of holistic and the, whatever parts are in you, then you feel like you're doing the best you can, and you're living true to your values and your hopes and dreams, essentially. So.
That's a really liberating way of sort of thinking about it. I'm seeing some nods as I look around going, yeah, that's a different way of looking at things. I think that sort of makes up a little bit of our approach towards creative careers, which can often be the sort of off-road variety, which is, well, there's no plan. That's one thing we've heard again and again today. There can't really necessarily be a plan towards a creative career. So actually we're all kind of making our own off-road journeys. And that's often the way I think we typically think about creative careers. But there's a route that's also on the road, Brian. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this in terms of, I think we're kind of all leaning towards often what are the variety of things we could do. But actually there could be some real fulfillment and satisfaction in staying in lane. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, so when we talked about this before, I'm coming from a kind of a position of being a musician and kind of working on either side of the funding wall, as we call it. So when I become a consultant, then I'm working with festivals, working with venues, working with organizations, working within companies, working within organizations. And I think that we need to rethink this idea of being independent and having that freedom, because there's a huge amount of potential and a huge amount of enjoyment that you can get working within an organization as well. And there's a risk when we focus too much on having to do it our own way, go our own path, go off-road. There's very little supports out there, and that could be quite an isolating place. It could be quite a lonely place. As someone said this morning, when the stuff hits the fan, you have very little support networks around you unless you've built those yourself. And as a mentor, I see mentees coming to me the whole time, and there's kind of three things that have stuck out to me as being sticky, as you say, from a career perspective, particularly within the arts and the creative sector. And the first is unrealistic expectations, that we come into a certain career thinking that we're chasing the dream and it's all going to be fantastic, but we don't kind of understand the reality of that. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where someone mentioned the idea of being poisoned by hope. I think there's a sense of, in the creative industry, that we're poisoned by hope. And then when it doesn't work out our way, we kind of have trouble dealing with that, which is quite an interesting perspective. And just to say that following your dreams is fantastic, but following your dreams is hard work. And I often see mentees coming to me going, I followed my dream, it's not working out, and it's actually quite hard work. Like, did you expect it wasn't going to be hard work? It's always hard work. So kind of having that expectation of what to expect is really, really interesting. The idea of working in isolation as well, as I mentioned, is another thing that comes to me. There's this rhetoric of going out on your own, being isolated in that way. There's other ways of working. Like, we don't have to work independently. We should be working interdependently. So we can work on our own initiative and with our own agency, but always with other people. That's so, so important. And the last bit is, as creatives or as artists, our work is so closely intertwined with who we are, our personal identity. So dealing with rejection, dealing with failure. If you don't get a project funded by the Arts Council, you take that as being, or we take that as being a kind of a personal slight on who we are. So kind of separating those and prioritizing what helps you to kind of separate and polarize your work and you as an individual. I think those are three things that have come across to me as being sticky.
Could you, thank you, that was very coherent, very clear, and very, yeah, I wish I'd written them all down. Could you share some of the benefits of that? You were speaking to the idea of individual creatives. Often, I'm sure we all have that feeling of being isolated at times, especially when the Arts Council funding hasn't come through, when the project hasn't been granted its money. What have some of the benefits for you been of actually being a part of an organisation, so working with others, essentially? Yeah.
So my best experience, and every organisation is different. There's some fantastic organisations out there, and I've also worked with some less than fantastic organisations. So this isn't a kind of an advocacy for jumping in with an organisation, but I worked with Edinburgh International Festival for a couple of years, and this is like a very big, very well-funded, very well-resourced organisation. And I know they're few and far between, but every victory we shared. You're part of something much, much bigger than yourself. So when the pressure gets too big for one individual, you kind of refer to your team, so you're in it as a team. And that counts for victories as well as for failures or for losses. Like when something goes bad, like I remember a couple of years ago, the day before a theatre show, we had one of the actresses died. So if you're dealing with that independently on your own, that's a huge amount of pressure. But because we were able to deal with it together within, obviously, a well-resourced organisation, but that support structure that you have working within an organisation and being part of something that's bigger than yourself, it elevates your own creativity, it elevates your own sense of well-being as well. And I think we don't talk about that enough when we talk about going our own way, going freelance, being independent. There's a certain sense of I want to be independent because I can't work with people. We need to get beyond that and work interdependently, like people working with other people, like we are today, collaborating, networking, meeting other people. That's so, so important.
Yeah, there's a lot in there in terms of shifting from that independent mindset towards actually how can we work with people, actually, and something about finding support either in the work or outside of the work, no matter where you are in the creative sector. And one way of doing that might be towards working with organizations in that sense. Just to shift the kind of conversation slightly, I know a lot of when we talk about career development and working in the arts, and rightly so, a lot of the conversation is about what we can do as individuals. How do we manage change? How can we network better, adapt to the way things are shifting and changing, which is necessary, absolutely, and a fundamental part of, I think, working in the sector. I think another part of the conversation is also, if that's sort of like playing the game, how do I sort of get better at that? There's also, I think, this idea of how might we change the game. Actually, how might we make changes, whether it be at an organizational level or a sector level, that actually makes it a little bit easier for us as individual creatives to kind of manage what are naturally complex careers. So I don't expect any of us to have answers to this fully. But I'm going to throw it out. I'm going to throw it out to the idea, to the panel, maybe yourself, Pamela, as well. The fact that this is the second Creative Career Summit, and we've definitely been creative for a lot of centuries before this, points to the idea that actually we are opening up a conversation and we are thinking differently, actually, I think, as a country and as a sector about creative careers. But yeah, in what ways should perhaps we be thinking about changing the game? What can large organizations do? What might be more helpful for creatives, for artists?
Well, I'm speaking obviously from the theatre sector perspective because that's the one I know. And definitely I think there was a shift post-COVID in this thinking around like where does the artist sit with the institution or the organisation. And so there's definitely more openness and things like people creating resource programs for artists, artist in residency programs with venues, platforms like that. You know, there's various people who have like 6 in the attic, you know, which became 12 in the attic because they added in 6 virtual places at the ITI, for example. So there's a little bit of shift in that thinking, but actually it's a little bit what you were talking about, Brian, as well, about going to meet the opportunity. I think if you are the artist, like, make that phone call, ask that question of the organisation, because I think the organisations are now waiting to be asked. And without getting into too much in depth about like policy stuff, I think you see that with the Arts Council at the moment in terms of some of the policies they're putting out, whether it's EDI policies, whether it's pay the artist policies. They're looking for the sectors and the organisations to enmesh and embed with artists a lot more. So I think, yeah, actually have that conversation in a very open way about what you, the artist, needs. Because the flip side may be that organisations presume that they know. And actually they are well informed within any given sector, but the needs of artists change quite regularly based on the world around us and how people are going about creating, whether that's with technology, new technologies, or new forms of collaboration. So tell them what you need explicitly. Go in with an ask.
Tell them what you need, which is exactly what Emma Holland from Minor Creative Minds asked us all to do just a little earlier, to actually, reach out, say what is needed. We've got 2.5 minutes. And I'm wondering if there's anybody, has got a question or a comment or a reflection maybe from the conversation, anything that you've heard maybe that you agree with, or anything that's actually sparked some ideas in your own mind that you'd be curious about. Want to leave a little time for that? Yeah, fantastic.
How are you guys? Really enjoyed that. Sarah, this one goes for yourself. You mentioned that you were a dancer and now you've went to, I suppose, the business side of the industry. Can you talk about, for someone in the room who maybe has explored the creative side and it just hasn't worked out, but they have an interest in the business, and I suppose personally making that decision to leave the creative side per se to work on the business side?
Yeah, thank you. I think, it's an interesting question. How do I do that? I don't. I think just being very open to stuff. I mean, I suppose when I'm running part of the training in Bow Street now, I taught in Bow Street years ago. I taught a few different subjects, and I think then, I said what I wanted. And I think we're sometimes afraid to kind of step into our power, as it were. But I think once you do that, you allow other people to do the same, because they see, oh, well, if they can do it. So I think it's empowering. And, we're talking about what needs to change. I don't think anything needs to change. I think we just need to kind of own what we're doing. And I think other people then see that light and they go, oh, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I suppose the business side of it, was relatively new. I was offered the job in Bow Street because I suppose I proven that I could teach there and stuff for years. And I suppose it's just wearing different hats. It was definitely a bit of a jump between dancing for Disney to the current. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to answer your question really. I think I just tried it and I loved it and it just worked out. So I don't know if that really answers the question. I think being open to stuff and saying what you want and being brave. And I think I'm brave to a point of stupidity often. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And this time it worked. But I think one thing I've learned over the past few years is that life is very short, and you just have to, grab the bull by the horns and hopefully it works. And also just don't be afraid to cold call people and email people and just go, what's the worst they can say? They can say no. So I think sometimes a bit of fear under you is very helpful because it puts a fire under you. And for me, moving countries was a fear because I didn't want to just start from the beginning again. And don't get me wrong, I first moved back here after being away for 12 years And I was like, well, I want to work in my field, but I didn't know anyone or anything, and everything had changed. So I started working in a creche, teaching drama to 4-year-olds because I needed money. So I'm not too, proud to kind of, but I was like, I'm going to just, so I think fear for me was a driving factor. So I think, get afraid.
Get afraid. It's a brilliant question, and I'm hearing the wisdom of the Feckett approach, which is that bravery. So it's time for us. Listen, thank you so much to Sarah, Brian, and Pamela for being here, and thank you for listening as well.